Sure, you all remember Ninja Gaiden, but what about Zelda Gaiden? When it comes to the Nintendo 64, or the Legend of Zelda franchise for that matter, few games were as daring or offered such a dramatic change of pace as Majora's Mask. As a direct successor to the genre-defining Ocarina of Time, the pressure was intense. After all, how do you follow up one of the most revolutionary video games of all time? However, rather than simply giving players more of the same, Nintendo delivered something altogether different, and something truly special. But here's the twist. There weren't originally any plans to make a sequel to Ocarina of Time on the Nintendo 64 at all. Nintendo's intentions had been quite different. Recently on this very channel we explored one half of their original strategy, the cancelled Ocarina of Time expansion disc, known as Ura Zelda. This expansion would have remixed the base game with new dungeons, puzzles, and even altered story elements, and it was designed specifically for the Nintendo 64's ambitious 64DD hardware. In today's video, however, we'll be examining the history of the other proposed expansion project, one that would have offered gamers an entirely new adventure rather than simply remixing what came before. I am Lady Decade, hit that subscribe button as this is the story of Zelda Gaiden, the other cancelled Ocarina of Time expansion pack. Let's journey back to the late 1990s, a period of significant change for both Nintendo and the gaming industry as a whole. The world had just been introduced to the groundbreaking Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, a title that successfully reimagined the classic top-down 2D formula of earlier Zelda games into a breathtaking cinematic 3D experience. Released in late 1998, it was hailed as a technical and artistic masterpiece, cementing Nintendo's place at the forefront of gaming innovation. But this incredible achievement didn't come easily. As we've touched on in previous videos, development was marked by numerous hurdles, including multiple delays and significant changes to hardware planning. Ocarina of Time and the Zelda series in general consists of video games that were so groundbreaking that they have influenced pretty much every hitter that exists today. But what is just as cool is that I know how you can save up to 90% on thousands of titles, including even the most recent releases. Get 31% off Monster Hunter Wilds, a ludicrous 47% off Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and money off pretty much any PC game that you can think of. Grab a bargain and support my work simultaneously by using my affiliate links down below. Happy shopping. At one point, Ocarina of Time was being designed for release on a magnetic disc format intended to run on the 64DD, Nintendo's new add-on hardware for the N64. These discs theoretically offered significantly greater storage capacity than standard cartridges, making them appealing to developers looking to build more expansive worlds. The goal was to use this increased capacity to create a more ambitious Zelda experience. Unfortunately, the 64DD's performance fell far short of expectations. The magnetic disc drive was too slow to handle the kind of real-time action needed for a fluid Zelda game. Mechanical moving parts made loading time sluggish, and when Nintendo couldn't even get Link's animations to work properly on the hardware, the idea was quickly abandoned. Just like that, the 64DD plan for Ocarina of Time was dead. Nintendo pivoted, and thankfully, they managed to squeeze Ocarina of Time onto a standard N64 cartridge, albeit with some clever compromises and deficient use of available memory. But even after that incredible save, the dream of using the 64DD to expand the game lived on. Their new plan was simple. Ocarina of Time would sit in the top slot of the Nintendo 64, while the additional content would be loaded in via 64DD expansion discs inserted below. Think of it as an early version of downloadable content, just with physical media, spinning drives, and 1990s Japanese stubbornness. The first of these expansions, Ura Zelda, would remix the base game with altered dungeons, puzzles, and new content. I've already covered that project in a separate video, so feel free to watch that if you want to understand the first half of Nintendo's grand plan. Today, however, it's time to delve into the history of the second expansion disc, the one that aimed to offer players a completely new adventure rather than a remix of what came before. This second project was known as Zelda Gaiden, with the name first cropping up publicly in May of 1999 when the Japanese gaming magazine Famitsu reported on its existence. By June, Nintendo had confirmed that the mysterious new content would be playable at Space World, their annual press extravaganza held in Japan. While some thought it might be little more than a reskin or dungeon pack, what would soon be revealed at that event was something far more ambitious. Just a week before the Space World exhibition, fresh details about Zelda Gaiden surfaced via IGN. Translating roughly to Zelda Side Story, the game was described by the outlet as a semi-sequel to Ocarina of Time. Not quite a direct continuation, but not a simple spin-off either. It was something in between. Crucially, they noted that many new additions were being implemented. According to their report, Zelda Gaiden was set to take place in a mysterious parallel world. Characters from Ocarina of Time would reappear, but in unfamiliar roles. Similar faces, different lives. It was a clever way of reusing assets while also creating a surreal and otherworldly atmosphere. The plot, as IGN described it at the time, would begin shortly after the events of Ocarina of Time, with players once again stepping into the pointy green boots of Child Link. After saving Hyrule and presumably enjoying a brief breather, Link would encounter a strange masked individual in the forest, a character IGN believed to be Skull Kid, who would accuse our hero of stealing his beloved horse, Epona. One thing would lead to another, and Link would end up falling into a strange dreamlike world, not unlike Alice, tumbling through the looking glass. A strange world. Familiar yet different characters. An air of surrealism. Well, that sounds awfully familiar, but also totally different. One of the major hooks of Zelda Gaiden, and what truly set it apart from Ocarina of Time, was the use of masks. Lots of masks. These weren't just collectibles or cosmetic accessories, they granted powerful new abilities and even transformed Link into entirely different species. A Zora, a Goron, even a Deku Scrub. Each form would offer unique movement, combat, and puzzle-solving abilities, dramatically shaping up the gameplay. IGN also reported that several weapons from Ocarina of Time would be making a return, only this time, young Link would be able to wield tools that were previously restricted to his adult counterpart. Combine that with a batch of fearsome bosses, and it was clear that Zelda Gaiden wasn't just going to be a lazy rehash, it was aiming for something experimental. Perhaps the most curious feature, though, was what IGN dubbed a real-time mechanic, a visual meter at the bottom of the screen showing the position of the sun and moon as time passed. They speculated that this real-time element might directly affect gameplay, perhaps altering character behaviours or triggering different events depending on the hour of the in-game day. In hindsight, this mechanic would become one of the most defining features of Majora's Mask, but at the time, it seemed more like a strange novelty. Essentially, a side experiment in an already unusual game. Space World 1999 would take place between August the 27th and 29th, and as promised, attendees were treated to full hands-on access to this strange new Zelda adventure. The game, Zelda Gaiden, was featured front and centre at Nintendo's booth, presented not as a tech demo but as a playable slice of what was described as a 50% complete game. According to Shigeru Miyamoto himself, what the public were playing was still early but very real. And despite its unfinished state, journalists note that the controls felt almost identical to Ocarina of Time. The combat, the movement, the camera, all of it would have felt instantly familiar to fans. However, no new weapons were featured in the demo, which added to the impression that this was very much still in flux. Even so, sharp-eyed attendees noticed that some aspects were already evolved. Visually, Zelda Gaiden seemed more vibrant and polished, with a greater variety of environmental detail. A handful of returning enemies were present, including Armos, Tektites, Keese, and Choo-Choos, alongside some more unusual inclusions, such as bows, white UFOs, and lily-pad platforms. While not a dramatic leap from Ocarina, the upgrades were enough to get people talking.
Whoa, nice graphics. I'd like to get my hands on that game.
You mean you haven't played it yet?
Now, to modern ears, this next bit might seem a bit strange, but back in 1999, there was still a lot of confusion. Many in the gaming press thought that Zelda Gaiden and Ura Zelda were the same project. It's no wonder really, both were Ocarina follow-ups, both were being developed around the same time, and both were tied to the 64DD hardware. However, after Space World, Miyamoto would finally step in to clarify matters once and for all. Ura Zelda and Zelda Gaiden were two completely separate projects. Not that it would matter for all that long. By the end of 1999, it had become painfully clear that the 64DD would be a commercial flop. The hardware had finally launched in Japan 2 years late, and was only available via mail order through Nintendo's oddly named RandNet online service. As sales failed to materialise, the device was repositioned as a niche piece of creative software rather than a mainstream platform for new game content. With that, the development of Zelda Gaiden as a 64DD expansion was quietly scrapped, but rather than abandoning the game entirely, something far more interesting happened. Around this time, Nintendo employee and future Zelda series director Eiji Aonuma was tasked with helping to complete Ura Zelda, later known as Master Quest in the West. But there was a problem. Aonuma absolutely hated the concept. Remixing old dungeons and slightly altering puzzles, it felt like a boring, soulless job to him. So, rather than sleepwalking through it, he secretly began designing entirely new dungeons in his spare time, purely as a creative outlet. Eventually, Aonuma worked up the courage to show Miyamoto what he'd been working on, and asked if, instead of remixing Ocarina of Time, he could make a whole new game from scratch. Miyamoto's response? Yes, but on one condition. He'd only have 1 year to finish it. How on earth was this even going to be possible? Ocarina of Time, with its sprawling world, intricate dungeon design and cinematic storytelling, took years to make. And now, Eiji Aonuma had just 12 months to deliver something new. Comically, upon receiving Miyamoto's blessing and that brutal 1 year deadline, Aonuma was said to have held his head in despair, already feeling the pressure mount. But rather than back out, he cautiously accepted the challenge. Fortunately, help would soon arrive in the form of Yoshiaki Koizumi, a rising star at Nintendo and the future director of Super Mario Galaxy. At the time, Koizumi had been working on a completely unrelated concept, a narrative-driven game about a character stuck in a repeating time loop, forced to relive the same week over and over again. If that sounds a little bit Groundhog Day to you, it's because it was.
Well, it's Groundhog Day. Again?
But here's where things clicked. Koizumi realised that time already existed in Ocarina of Time. The sun would rise and set, the world moved in cycles. So the idea of compressing the adventure into a short repeating time frame actually fits perfectly with the existing engine. Thus, the team began to develop what would become one of the most iconic mechanics in Zelda history. A repeating 3-day cycle that players would live, relive and manipulate to progress through the game. Early coverage of Zelda Gaiden still referred to a 7-day cycle, with characters living out unique routines across a full week of in-game time. However, during development, this proved to be far too confusing. Too much to track, too many overlapping schedules, too many villagers were wandering about with agendas no one could remember. So the system was trimmed down to 3 days, which not only made the game easier to program, but also made the time loop mechanic feel tighter and more focused. To save even more time, the developers began recycling assets from Ocarina of Time. Character models, animations, weapons, and even parts of the world's map were reused, but placed into an entirely different narrative context. This is where the brilliance of the parallel world concept really paid off. Familiarity would be reframed as strangeness, and reused assets could feel intentional. Savvy. Aonuma also wanted to revisit some ideas from Ocarina that hadn't been fully explored. One of the biggest was masks. In Ocarina of Time, the mask trading quest was fun, but ultimately quite limited. Here, he sought to push the concept to its absolute limit. Giving Link the ability to physically transform using masks wasn't just a fun gimmick, it redefined how players approached exploration, combat, and puzzles. The results? A completely different kind of Zelda game, built in record time, using scraps from the past and ideas borrowed from a discarded time loop project. And yet somehow, it worked. In November 1999, Nintendo officially announced a planned release date for Zelda Gaiden, aiming to have the game ready in time for the 2000 holiday season, but just 5 months later on the 1st of March of the new millennium, the name Zelda Gaiden was dropped altogether. The project, which had started out as a humble 64DD expansion disc, had now evolved into something far more substantial. It was no longer being treated as a side story. This was now a full-blown Zelda title, and with that came a new name. According to Nintendo Power, the game would henceforth be known as The Legend of Zelda Mask of Mueller in Japan and Majora's Mask in the West. Alongside the name change came a flurry of brand new screenshots showcasing a game that looked darker, moodier, and frankly stranger than anything Nintendo had released before. But there was one more surprise. Unlike Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask would require more than just a standard Nintendo 64 console to run. This time around, you'd need the 4MB expansion pack, a memory upgrade that plugged into the console's RAM slot. While only a handful of games supported it, Majora's Mask demanded it, and for good reason. IGN speculated that this requirement was a holdover from the game's early days as a 64DD project, where the extra disk space and system memory would have been standard. With that luxury gone, the expansion pack became a necessity. Those 4MB of additional RAM enabled more accurate dynamic lighting, improved texture detail, complex special effects such as motion blur, and allowed for more characters on screen at once. Even the game's draw distance had been enhanced, allowing players to see far across the world without the fog effects that plagued Ocarina of Time. Spooky. So, what began as a modest Ocarina expansion pack, Zelda Gaiden, had transformed into a fully fledged sequel, but how did this peculiar, darker, time-bending entry stack up against its legendary predecessor? Surprisingly pretty damn well. Critics were quick to point out how impressive the game was, especially considering the fact that it had been developed in under a year. A feat that sounded impossible, and yet Nintendo had pulled it off. Game Informer called the 3-day cycle one of the most inventive premises in all of gaming, and boldly declared, Majora's Mask is, without question, the finest adventure the Nintendo 64 has to offer. Edge magazine labelled it the oddest, darkest and saddest of all Zelda games, a striking tonal departure that set it even further apart from anything that had come before. N64 magazine chimed in with, we were told Majora's Mask should cower in the shadow of Ocarina of Time. Instead, it shines just as brightly. But perhaps the most telling praise came from IGN, who described the finished game as The Empire Strikes Back of Nintendo 64. It's the same franchise, but it's more intelligent, darker, and tells a much better storyline. Whether you love the game for its originality or struggle with just how far it strayed from the classic Zelda formula, one thing is certain. Majora's Mask is unlike anything else in the series, and considering it was cobbled together in the space of a year, that only makes the achievement all the more impressive. Zelda Gaiden may have never reached the market in its original form, but in its place we got something bolder, riskier, and arguably more memorable. A game that challenged what a sequel could be and dared to go to darker places. Don't forget that you can save up to 90% on thousands of titles, including even the most recent releases. Get 31% off Monster Hunter Wilds, a ludicrous 47% off Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and money off pretty much any PC game you can think of. Grab a bargain and support my work simultaneously by using my affiliate links below. Alternatively, if you'd like to show your support in a more personal way, you can gain access to my behind-the-scenes cosplay library and more via Patreon and YouTube memberships. I'll see you all again soon.